Okay. Hopefully everybody has the piece of paper I left for you with our outline for tonight. On the back side, it also has our outline for the whole book of Revelation, just so we can kind of stay oriented, see where we are. So tonight we're going to be talking about the dragon and the two beasts. Really, we're going to spend most of our time talking about these two beasts that are introduced to us in Revelation chapter 13. But just so you remember where we are, it's more detail on the back of your paper, but here we are in this middle section on the dragon, the beasts, and the lamb. This is where we are, okay? Chapter 13, so sort of the middle of this middle section. And this section, if you'll remember, is kind of like a break. It's a little bit of a parenthesis. We had the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and before we get the 7 plagues or bowls, we have a break of these 3 chapters where we're going to talk about and focus in on the dragon. Last week we talked about the woman and the dragon. Very important chapter, Revelation chapter 12, probably the center of the book. And now tonight we're going to focus on these beasts that we have introduced to us here in chapter 13. There's a lot of interesting stuff. And so I'm hoping that we can have some good conversations tonight. I'll try to leave plenty of time, plenty of room for you guys to ask questions so that we can maybe kind of pursue some of that. So here's our outline, okay, of this whole major section. And you can see the yellow is where we are tonight. All right, we had this chapter 12 is all one section. Chapter 13 is broken into 2 parts, but we'll do our best to cover both of them. In chapter 14, I've got broken into 3 smaller parts. So here's the main point. I try to give you the main point every week because we start talking about stuff and it's easy to kind of get lost in the details and miss the main point. So here's the main point. That through the beast from the sea and the beast from the land, those are the 2 beasts we're talking about. So through these 2 beasts, Satan will attack God's people through evil governments and false religions throughout the church age. This is going to continue to happen. But now we're seeing, and we've seen that theme over and over about about Satan or, wicked people continuing to persecute God's people. But now we're seeing the means that he's using. That is this beast from the sea, beast from the land, that as we'll see, point us toward evil governments and false religions. So what we end up with is this sort of unholy trinity. We've already been introduced to the dragon, and he's coming back in chapter 13. And what we'll see as we read through chapter 13 is the dragon is more or less served by, or you might even say represented by, the beast from the sea. So there's some similarities and characteristics between the dragon and the beast from the sea. So the beast from the sea is, in a sense, Satan's representative in the world, doing his bidding, doing his work. But then in turn, the beast from the sea is served by, or represented by, the beast from the land, who is later in Revelation referred to as the false prophet. So those are the same, the beast from the land, the false prophet. So most of the time when we think about Revelation, you just hear people talk about the beast. And now here we're introduced to 2 beasts. Well, that's because later on, you generally have references to the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet later in the book of Revelation. So that the beast, throughout the rest of Revelation, refers to the first beast who comes out of the sea, and the false prophet refers to the second beast, the beast that comes from the land or out of the land. So that may help clarify a few things, hopefully. But these 3 together sort of, in a sense, are a counterfeit of the Father and the Son and the Spirit. And in different ways, we're going to see these 2 beasts also sort of counterfeit the work of Christ in different ways, the person and work of Christ. So, let's look at the beast from the sea. We'll just walk through the text, okay? First, we get a description of this particular beast in the first 2 verses, where we are told, John says, "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems or crowns on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. So a few things about this particular beast, just so we know from the description. First of all, we're told that he comes from the sea. Now, in the ancient world, the sea, or the deep, or the abyss, was often viewed as sort of the abode of evil. And that makes sense if you're living in the ancient world and you've spent any time on the waters. Not only do you know it's incredibly dangerous, but what happens if you fall into the sea? Who knows, right? I mean, you just sink into the blackness, and who knows? And there are all sorts of creatures out there that can get you. And storms come up at any time. The sea is a dangerous place, a place of chaos and turmoil. And so the ancients would have viewed it this way. And we see that even in the Old Testament. We even see it later in the book of Revelation when we get the description of the new heavens and new earth where it says there's no sea. Well, if we interpret that literally, that's going to be a pretty strange looking world with no sea. But it's not meant to be interpreted literally. It's the idea that the sea represents evil, or the place from which evil comes. And so in the new heavens and new earth, there's no more evil. And so the place where they come from is at least symbolically removed from there. In fact, when you read the very last verse of chapter 12, we get this reference to someone standing on the sand of the sea. And so chapter 12 ends after describing this back and forth between the woman and the dragon with someone standing on the sand of the sea. Now, the reason I point that out is just really simple, that some ancient manuscripts say, and I stood on the sand of the sea. And some of them say, and he stood on the sand of the sea. It's a difference of one letter. That's all it is. One simple little letter in the manuscripts. So that on the one hand, it might be saying that John was standing on the seashore, the beach, and as he's looking out and watching, he sees this beast rise out of the sea. On the other hand, the point may be that the dragon that John has been talking about is now standing on the shore, and he calls this beast up out of the sea. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't change our interpretation of chapter 13 or of chapter 12. But later on, we're going to see another, maybe more significant textual variant, and you could make a big deal out of it, but in the same way, at the end of the day, it doesn't really change very much. We shouldn't make a big deal out of some of these differences in the manuscripts when they don't affect the meaning of the text. And they hardly ever do really affect the meaning of the text in front of us. So we have either John or Satan standing on the seashore, calling this beast or watching this beast arise out of the sea. The description of the beast itself is really interesting, because on the one hand, it's described in the same way that the dragon is described, right? 7 heads with 10 horns, same description that we got of the dragon. So that this beast represents the dragon himself. You might say that he is the incarnation of the dragon, right? Takes on the same basic form of the dragon. But then in the more extended description, you have all of these different animals, these combinations of animals. And there John is drawing on Daniel chapter 7. So in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel describes 4 different beasts. And these 4 different beasts represent earthly kingdoms. Now scholars debate which kingdoms they represent. It's probably Babylon and maybe Persia, Greece, okay? Possibly even Rome after that. Or maybe one of the kingdoms that followed Greece as Greece fell apart and there were some short-lived kingdoms that were ruling over the area. It's hard to know. But those beasts, those 4 beasts in Daniel, definitely represent human kingdoms. And what John does is he takes different aspects of these 4 beasts. He doesn't pick one of those beasts and then describe this beast as being just like it. He doesn't do that. Instead, he takes different aspects of each of those beasts from Daniel chapter 7, And he uses those different animals that make up those other beasts. He uses them in his description of this one beast that came out of the sea. So we can say a couple of things here. That the beast from the sea, yes, represents the dragon, is in a sense the incarnation of the dragon, the representative of the dragon in the world. But also, we should recognize that the background of Daniel should lead us to say that this beast is manifested in some way through either a particular empire or kingdom, or maybe even through multiple empires and kingdoms. Interpreters go different directions with that, but where everyone agrees, though, that because of the background in Daniel, we should understand this first beast to be manifested in the form of human governments or empires, large, powerful empires. Maybe a particular one, maybe several. We'll get to that. We'll talk about that. All right, but this is the basic description of the beast, and those are the two things to keep in mind. He represents the dragon, and he should be associated with a human kingdom. Okay? So that's the description. Next, you get the worship of the beast in verses 3 and 4. Let's see here. Let me find my place. And it says on verse 3, and one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. And the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who can fight for us? So here's a way in which the first beast sort of imitates Christ. He has what's described as a mortal wound to his head, and yet he comes back, he returns in a kind of mock resurrection, if you will. So you have a similarity to the Lamb who was slain and then rose, but it's a mock similarity. They're not the same at all. And the whole purpose of all of this is to generate worship of the beast and worship of Satan, the dragon whom he represents. That's the whole purpose of it. That's what's happening here. Now, a lot has been made out of this mortal wound and him rising, coming back from the dead. So that if you interpret Revelation chapter 13 and the beasts in it as only referring to events right before the return of Christ, and that's how many, many people interpret the book of Revelation. We've said this several times, that all of these various figures are figures just at the very end of time. I've argued that most of the book of Revelation is describing everything from Christ's first coming all the way up to his second coming. That's been my argument. But if you take it to refer to only institutions and people that are here in those last few years before the final judgment, then you'll want to know, well, who is this beast who seems to die and come back to life? And so if you've read, say, the Left Behind books or watched some of those movies, you'll see it's always an individual who then somehow in these fictionalized treatments, he's killed or appears to be killed and comes back, and that's what generates people's worship. All right? And even those who view the book of Revelation in the completely opposite sense, referring to almost entirely events from the first century, because there are people on both ends of that. People who interpret Revelation as being only in reference to the last few years of existence on the earth, and those who interpret to refer to almost entirely to the first century. And those who interpret it as referring almost entirely to the first century look for Roman rulers who might fit the bill. And so a lot of times they'll say, oh, this must be Nero, because Nero famously committed suicide, but then there were rumors for decades after his death that he didn't really die, and there were even various people across the Roman Empire and in other places claiming to be Nero, to have survived or to have come back. And so some have said, well, that's what John is drawing on, this myth of a Nero who comes back. So you have people looking in both directions. But what I think we should do is is read this in light of the Old Testament and in light of chapter 12. And remember, chapter 12 is a description of the ongoing battle that begins in Genesis 3:15, where the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman have enmity against one another. Eventually, the seed of the woman crushes the head of the serpent, right? And chapter 12 is drawing on all of that. And it's not even subtle in the ways in which chapter 12 is showing this is how Genesis 3:15 has played out. Okay, well now we have a beast who looks just like the dragon, who represents the dragon, and who causes people to worship the dragon, and he's wounded in the head. Okay? I don't think any of that's accidental. I think the point here is to say that in Christ's death, he has dealt the final blow to Satan and to all those who serve Satan. But that does not mean that with this wound, this particular beast is done and down and out for the count, or even this particular head, one of 7 heads of the beast, is down and out, because it's not. He's going to continue to rage throughout the church age, and that's what's happening. Yeah. Sure.
Just so I understand, so the argument is that this isn't like a linear timeline description of just,
Right.
Right. That it's merely referencing what happened in the garden and with
Yeah. I think this mortal wound to the head of the beast from the sea is a way of saying that Christ on the cross, he defeated the serpent or the dragon and both beasts, particularly this first beast. They're defeated. But that doesn't mean that, because if he leaves it at that, we'll think, oh good, that's not a problem anymore. But that's not the case, because this beast is continuing to be at work in the world. So, yeah, that's how I understand it. So I'm not looking for a particular individual who's going to die and come back to life. Okay? I'm not looking for that. Or I'm not looking in the past for a particular individual who supposedly died and then reappeared somewhere else. Again, there are interpreters who do that, and they'll make their case for it. But I don't think it fits the context here, and I don't think it fits the overall pattern that we're seeing in Revelation. The main point, though, to see in these verses, though, is the purpose of this beast. The purpose of this beast, his work, his goal, is to cause people to worship himself and the dragon. And then we go on and we find this description of the beast's words as blasphemous words. We're told that the beast was given a mouth to utter, mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. That's another reference, 42 months, 2.5 years, times time and half a time. And again, I've said, I think that symbolically refers to the entire church age. That's how I've interpreted it each time I see it. So if I'm right about that, maybe I'm not, but if I am, then this beast is given authority throughout the church age. It says it opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. So I take this first beast to be representative of evil human governments that demand absolute allegiance and in many ways occupy the place of God. And I don't limit that to Rome, but that was certainly, in John's context, that was the empire that was active in doing that at the time. The Roman Empire, by the time that John wrote Revelation, emperor worship had become very widespread. One of the reasons that Christians had begun to be persecuted, in fact, was because they insisted that Jesus is Lord, rather than the well-known Roman saying that Caesar is Lord. It was their refusal to confess Caesar as Lord and their constant confession of Jesus as the only Lord that they were often persecuted. And so it makes sense for John to hone in on this aspect of the Roman Empire where worship is being directed toward the emperor and the empire as a whole, and Christians are being persecuted for refusing to participate in that. I think that's what John is thinking of as he describes the visions that he's having. But it's not limited to the Roman Empire. I think we see it periodically throughout history when we have these kinds of totalitarian governments that demand absolute allegiance. And not always there. Sometimes it's not that the government is demanding allegiance, but sometimes it's that the people are willingly giving over their worship to some sort of human ruler or government. And that happens all the time. So, my understanding of the first beast from the sea is that he represents wicked human governments that receive or demand worship from people. So we move on. It says, let's see here. Lastly, we get war on the saints. And it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given to it over every tribe and people and language and nation. So that's another way in which this beast is counterfeiting the work of Christ. And all who dwell on the earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of the life of the Lamb who was slain. And then he issues this call for perseverance. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword he must be slain. Here's a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. Again, John never promises us that we will escape persecution or tribulation. He never promises us that. He says the opposite. These things will happen. Some of you will be taken captive. Some of you will be slain with the sword. And so therefore, I'm calling you to endure through it all. Because this first beast will do those things. If you refuse to play along and you refuse to worship this beast, you will suffer. That's the first beast. So let me pause and give you a chance to ask questions about this first beast. Yes.
And with those people probably being much more familiar with this style of writing.
Uh-huh.
Is there any indications that they picked up on this stuff right away? Seeing that this was almost is it fair to call this almost like an allegorical type of writing? Am I being the wrong word there?
It's very similar to allegory. It's not strictly speaking allegory, but it's similar. Yeah. A lot of it they would have. Now, most early interpreters understood this beast to simply be the Roman Empire. Because every generation of Christians has believed that they are the last generation. Now, we have the benefit of now 2,000 years of that. And so we look back on numerous empires and kingdoms that could have played this role. But at their time, there was only one contender, right? And as far as they were concerned, Jesus is going to come back any moment anyway. So Rome just is the beast for most early interpreters. So the first couple of centuries after the New Testament, they're just reading it and they're going, yeah, that's just Rome. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
From that point on, we are living in this time
Yes.
of Satan having been wounded. I mean, death is imminent. We know we lost the
Right.
battle. We live in the
Yes. My understanding of the 42 months or 2.5 years is that is a symbolic description of the whole church age. So what we're seeing is in different visions and in different ways, John is describing the circumstances that are common and lead up to the final judgment. Of course, at the end of each of these sections, whether you're one of the sections of sevens or even in this section, they always lead up to the final judgment, and then sometimes you get a little bit of a peek of the new heavens and new earth, but they always lead to the final judgment, and you get more and more graphic descriptions of that final judgment the closer you get to the end of the book of Revelation. So there is an emphasis in Revelation on the final judgment, and the further you get into it, the more detailed are the descriptions of that judgment. But I'm not reading it in the book of Revelation chronologically, so that it's just same period of time in layers over and over described in different ways.
And just when you said that it's a kingdom, nation, seeking that worship, I'm just trying to think, like, we're in the church age here in the United States of America. Certainly that's not our government. However, the average person doesn't believe and is living as they are their own God.
Right.
So it's not so much the government that's doing it, but it is.
That's why I said either demands or receives. So I think it's always a threat that we would be drawn away to worship human governments. It's always a threat. And those may be very, very evil, obviously wicked, like, say, Nazi Germany, but it may not be so obvious. I mean, the Roman Empire did a lot of incredible things, good things. Paul calls it God's servant in Romans 13. By the time that John's writing this, they're persecuting Christians. They're viewed more negatively. It's not as if the Roman Empire is just all bad. They built all the roads, they did a lot of good things. Compared to other large world empires, they're actually pretty humane and decent. Not compared to our standards today, but compared to, say, the Assyrians or the Babylonians, they're pretty decent folks as far as conquerors go. But they still are the beast here. And so I don't take it for granted that America could never be in the place of the beast. Or any nation, could be in that place. So there are other reasons, but that's one reason why, say, on July 4th, while I encourage people, we should be thankful for our freedom and celebrate the country we live in, we're not going to sing the national anthem in worship. We're not going to hoist an American flag in the middle of worship. We're not going to do it because that's not what we're here for. You can be patriotic, but there are lines that shouldn't be crossed. This is one of the reasons I don't want to cross those lines, because of this kind of stuff. So it's in every age, in every generation, there's always this threat of the beast, and he can come in various forms. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I do think that as you move through, when you get closer to the final judgment, and then when you read, for instance, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 1 John chapter 4, one of the really important things that John teaches us is that there are many antichrists, but then there's also a final antichrist. That's a good way to say it. There are many antichrists. So John says, as you have heard, Antichrist is coming into the world, and many antichrists have come. So what I'm saying here about this representing human governments in general doesn't mean that there cannot be a final, ultimate Antichrist, right? And you say, well, you're talking about it in terms of kingdoms and empires. Yes, but they're always headed by someone, by a Caesar, right? So, yeah. So I'm not arguing that there's not a final version of this that's headed up by an individual that you could call the Antichrist. Or, as Paul calls him in 2 Thessalonians, the man of lawlessness. That is true. But if we limit it to that, we'll miss the dangers that are present in our own time, I think. So it's moving in that direction, and there is a final Antichrist, but there's also Antichrist in every generation, every age. Yeah. That's a great question. And Antichrist is present not only in the first beast, but the second beast. So, all right, any other questions about the first beast? All right, let's say a few things about the second beast. I already mentioned this, but just so you know, the beast from the land, the second beast, later in the book of Revelation, is identified as the false prophet. So I don't want you to think, where'd this guy go? Where is he? He's the same as the false prophet. So he's present in other places. So again, we're going to start off with a description of this particular beast. Verse 11, then I saw another beast rising out of the earth, or out of the land. It had 2 horns like a lamb. So that lamb imagery, Jesus is the only other lamb in the book of Revelation. Okay? It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. So it can appear in forms that seem to represent Christ. Looks like a lamb, but it's the dragon's voice always. That's important. And then it says it exercises all of the authority of the first beast in its presence and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose mortal wound was healed. So, just as the first beast leads people to worship the dragon, the second beast leads people to worship the first beast. So they're all working in concert. And then we get the work of the beast. Let's see, verse 13. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. So that's one of the great miracles of the Old Testament, of one of the prophets. So it's a counterfeit signs. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both slave and free, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead. We'll come to that. In terms of the work of the beast, though, the work of the beast is mainly about persuading people to worship the first beast. That really fits a Roman context, where you have emperor worship, so that the older religions of Rome and Greece are now directing people toward emperor worship. And in many of these cities, there were shrines that had been and were being built to various Caesars. Even massive, tall statues, very much like the one that you see in the book of Daniel of Nebuchadnezzar. You have these massive statues of the various emperors, and the people would come and worship. And they were ascribed, they were called sons of God, gods, lords. So that I think that the first beast, just in terms of its first century context, is Rome, and the second beast is the imperial religious cult. Okay? But I'm not limiting it to that, and I don't think John limits it to that. So we want to take a step back a little bit and say, okay, so if the first beast can be manifested in various empires and kingdoms, so also this second beast can be manifested in various false religions. And that's what we see that throughout church history. And many times, these two beasts, practically speaking, I mean, here they're aligned, but many times we see them aligned together. So that you get a false religion or a corrupted version of Christianity that becomes a pillar and a support for one of these wicked empires. I would really argue that if Christianity is the dominant shaping religion in a nation, then before that nation can become a representative of the beast, you've got to get Christianity out of the way. So you might think, well, what about Nazi Germany? Weren't they all Lutherans? They were all Lutherans, except that the German Lutheran Church had been corrupted for over a century by liberal theology. They didn't believe the Bible anymore. And they didn't believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. They didn't believe that he was really and truly God. By and large, the church in Germany had become something other than the Church of Christ. There were exceptions, of course, right? There were Bonhoeffers and others who remained faithful to the truth or the core of Christianity. But on the whole, it was liberalized, and what you had was not a liberal version of Christianity, you had another religion. Progressive Christianity is not a form of Christianity. It is a false religion. That's what was present in Germany. Were it not for that, the Nazis would have never risen to power. It wouldn't have been possible. So you always have to have either an entirely separate religion or a corrupted form of Christianity that's not really Christianity anymore. Teaming up with the first beast and persecuting the people of God. Now, for the really interesting stuff. Oh, sure.
These are all false religions, false gods.
Uh-huh.
Is it going to be working towards
I think that I think the final form of the beasts is going to be more worldwide in scope, larger than what we've seen. But the details on that are few in Revelation or in the rest of the New Testament. But yeah, I think so. Okay, so we know who the second beast is, the false prophet. We know what his work is. It's to get people to worship the first beast. But then there's this interesting stuff at the end about the mark of the beast and the number of the beast. So let me read that. I already read verse 16 earlier, but I'm going to read it again. It says, also it, this beast from the land, causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both slave and free, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So the mark of the beast. Now, when I was growing up, everything I heard about the mark of the beast was that you better watch out. It's coming. Might be a tattoo, like a barcode or something. Then maybe a microchip, something, a physical mark on your hand or forehead that could literally be used as some sort of, electronic form of payment or whatever, okay? That's not at all what John's talking about. It's not at all what John has in mind. I don't think he even means a literal mark on the hand or forehead. There are a lot of reasons why I mean that. One reason is you just have to keep reading. Because if you keep reading into the next chapter, verse 1 of chapter 14, John says, then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. Right? So the mark of the beast is the counter of the mark of the Lamb. That's what it is. And we don't put physical marks on our hands or foreheads to mark us out as Christians. It didn't do it in John's time, and we don't do it now. It's not meant to be understood literally. If we take the mark of the beast literally, then we need to read this literally. And nobody does. Nobody reads this literally. The other reason that I don't think it's a literal mark is because I think the Old Testament background is Deuteronomy chapter 6, where you find the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God. You know the rest of that. And then you're to take the law and you are to bind it, right, on your hands and forehead. That's what you're supposed to do with it. That's okay. You're to bind it on your hands and forehead. That's what you do with the law. So, now the many Jewish people literally applied that, right? Taking the Shema, putting it little things to wear, think bindings on your wrist, putting it on your wrist, little tiny scrolls, right? We know that. But we know the point of Deuteronomy 6 is not really to encourage the people of Israel to wear tiny scrolls around on their forehead or their hands. The point is that your thinking and your doing should be shaped and determined by God's law. That's the point. The mark of the beast is the exact opposite of that. It's your thinking and your acting being determined by the priorities of the beast. So there are only two options. You either have the mark of the beast or you have the mark of the Lamb. And we don't need to worry about the latest technology or when these things are going to be implemented by some government. We don't need to be worried about that. We just need to ask ourselves, do I bear the Lamb's mark on my own forehead? That's the only question to ask. Is my name written in the Lamb's book of life? That's what really matters. So, as interesting as it is to read about people's speculations about the mark of the beast, I don't think it's a physical mark at all. Now, the number of the beast is another interesting thing, 666. A lot of you know probably that you can practice something called gematria, where letters stand for numbers, right? And you could look at a person's name, for instance, and you could sort of calculate the numerical value of their name with the numbers. That's gematria, all right? And many people think that's what John is encouraging the readers to do, to figure out what letters are adding up to 666 or 666. Figure out what letters are adding up to that, and if you can solve that riddle, then you'll know the name of the beast. And so many people have come up with ways for it to add up to Nero Caesar. The only problem with that is, in order for it to work, you have to spell Caesar in a way that it's not normally spelled. Not only do you have to spell it in a way that's not normally spelled, you have to do it in Hebrew. You can't do it using Latin letters because it won't add up to the right number. You can't do it using Greek letters, the language that Revelation is written in. It won't add up. You've got to use Hebrew letters, and you've got to spell Caesar in an unusual way with an extra, with an extra letter that it doesn't normally have, okay, in order to get Caesar Nero to add up to 666. Then on the other hand, some people pointed out that each of Ronald Reagan's names, each name has 6 letters. Could it be Ronald Reagan? People have found ways for it to be Barack Obama, everybody. John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, lots of, suggestions out there. Now, I said I was going to mention a textual variant. Some of you have a note in your Bibles that some early manuscripts actually have 616, which throws us for a loop there. Now, probably 666 is probably what the original said, but the evidence for 616 is pretty impressive. And there's at least some possibility that originally said 616, which would mess up everybody's, attempts to figure out what individual this might be. So, consistent with how I've been interpreting Revelation, I'm going to take these numbers as symbolic, okay? Each digit is 1 short of 7, the number of completion. So just as the false prophet and the beast are a counterfeit of Christ, so also I think the number of the beast is falling short of the perfection that we would see in God. So that I think what John is saying here, be understanding, be wise, and recognize the difference between these two beasts and the true Christ. Know the difference. That's at least how I understand it. Okay, plenty of people will make arguments, though, for different individuals in history. Some of those arguments are more convincing than others. None of them have convinced me so far, but probably the most impressive ones are actually some of them for Nero. But again, it's not enough to convince me because of some of the weird stuff you have to do. So the mark of the beast I take as symbolic for who gets your allegiance. And then the number of the beast I take as symbolic as saying the beast himself is a counterfeit and falls short of the true Christ. All right. Now, questions and comments about those things. Okay, sure.
So I was going to say it's interesting and comment-wise because you say that it falls short of perfection, and so I find it interesting that we are called to worship the Holy Trinity, and here you have the
Yeah,
corrupted Trinity
right.
before your eyes in this description. So I just think that's really interesting.
Yeah,
How we're called to do this, and yet it falls short as they're trying to get your worship.
yeah,
This whole false Trinity, and using the same exact, not the same exact, but similar to what Jesus does, and that's what they're going to use to
yeah.
pull away to the false Trinity. And I just think that's very interesting.
And at least in appearance, it looks similar. Like 6 is not far off of 7, right? That's why it's convincing to so many people. Yeah. Yeah, good. Greg?
When you were talking about the national anthem and not singing it in church,
Yes.
understand that we don't want to have worship of our government,
Yeah.
particularly in church. But how about when you go to a sporting event, like a baseball game, and before the game starts, everyone stands up and sings the national anthem?
I sing. Yeah.
That's not a problem?
Not for me. I'm patriotic. I'm glad to be here. I think when you're coming into we gather for worship. That's what we're here for. And so if we begin to sing and laud anything or anyone else, praise anything or anyone else, that's a problem in the context of worship, corporate worship. But I'm happy to sing the national anthem and say the Pledge of Allegiance in other places and times. Doesn't bother me at all. No. I don't think so. Lisa?
What do you think then is the significance when John is saying, talking about the mark of the beast, that they won't be able to buy or sell? Like there's some sort of impact that's happening
Yeah.
in the market system. And so what do you think?
So there is, I think part of the background of that, and this is something we talked about early in Revelation. We were looking at the 7 letters or 7 messages to the churches, where for many people to actually pursue your vocation, you had to be a part of a guild, so a blacksmith's guild or bricklayer's guild. And most of those guilds in the Greco-Roman world had gatherings, and they would worship some sort of designated deity who was associated with that guild. And Christians abstained from that. And John commends those who abstained from that. But that sometimes would mean that they were cut off from their work and even cut off from the community, and they had no means by which to purchase anything or do anything. I think that may be, in terms of the immediate historical context, some of the possible ramifications. But I think that there are probably a lot of other ways that economically Christians can be punished by these kinds of nations and countries and governments. Yeah. Right, yeah. Yeah, come in and take all your stuff and everything that your family's gained over years. Just take it, put it in their own museums, and pretend that it's theirs. Yeah, and there's no reason that can't happen to Christians as well. You know, the difference is it's easier to identify a group of Jews because they're culturally separate than it is to identify individual Christians. But there are certain things you can do to make us stand out, like tell people to bow down to an idol. That'll make us stand out. So yeah, it's a whole thing. That's what they're doing, right? And the fact that none of us have directly experienced that is just a sign of God's blessing upon us, right? His protection and care for us, which he promises in chapter 12, but still the dragon goes off to make war. So wherever he can. So there are plenty of people living in places where they're told, bow down and your family will be provided with food and you'll be allowed to live. Refuse and will kill you and maybe your family. There are plenty of places in the world right now where that's happening. So, Greg.
So during the Reformation,
Mhm.
didn't they look at Pope
Yes.
Catholic
hmm
Church as the beast?
Yeah, they're not the first people to do it. In fact, lots of Roman Catholics were pointing at various popes throughout the Middle Ages as being the final Antichrist. Right? Many of them thought, this pope over here, this one. So lots of times. And then the popes in turn were pointing at other people, as an Antichrist. At the time of the Reformation, the Pope said that it was Prince Frederick who was sort of the financial backer of Luther. Well, he's the Antichrist. He's the first beast because he's a government ruler and he's backing Luther and Luther's false teachings, according to the Pope. So they were pointing the finger at each other constantly. So the popes and others said the reformers were Antichrist. The reformers said the popes were Antichrist, all over the place. So, oh yeah. I mean, it was kind of the standard Protestant view is that the pope in one form or another, either all the popes or one particular pope, it's kind of the standard Protestant view that was Antichrist all the way up until the 20th century. So
It's not incorrect to call them antichrist.
I wouldn't. No, and Antichrist. Anybody who denies the gospel and then invites and encourages worship of idols, it's perfectly fine to say that's an Antichrist. Yeah.
Yeah, because antichrist isn't mentioned in Revelation at all. It's only in
1 John. Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't have a problem with that. It just if you're identifying like the final ultimate form of Antichrist, that's when I wouldn't say, oh, it's definitely this pope here or this pope here. I don't know, but anybody who's endorsing a false gospel and encouraging idolatrous practices, that's an Antichrist. Yep. All right, we're over time, and Jessica's in there with the kids, and I can hear them. So let me pray. I'll hang out if you have questions, but those who have kids, go get your kids, all right? God, thank you for letting us spend some time talking about the scriptures tonight. We thank you that you've revealed these things to us in Revelation 13 so that we wouldn't be foolishly conducting ourselves in the world as if there are no real threats to your people, that there's not a kingdom of darkness that opposes the kingdom of Christ. So help us always to live with that in light of that knowledge, to be thankful of the times when you take us into the wilderness and protect us, like many of us experience here in America, but also to be aware that the dragon continues to make war on your people across the world, and there's no reason to think that he couldn't begin to make war more directly upon us as well. Help us to always remember that and to put our hope in Christ through whatever may come. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.